Kingsley Davis was born in 1908 in the small town of Tuxedo, Texas. Some rumors suggest that he may have been a grandnephew of Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America. He grew up in Wichita Falls, Texas, and graduated from the University of Texas at Austin in 1930 with a degree in English. He then completed a master's degree in philosophy, also at UT Austin. For the next 3 years, he took doctoral level courses in Harvard's sociology department and then took a teaching position at nearby Smith College, so he was already teaching when he completed his PhD from Harvard in 1936. Over the following 60 years, Davis continued his academic career at several leading universities, including especially the University of California at Berkeley, where he founded and for many years directed the Center for International Population and Urban Research. It was there that I studied with him, and he directed my doctoral dissertation in the 1970s. Davis served as president of both the American Sociological Association and the Population Association of America, and was the first sociologist elected to the National Academy of Sciences. He coined the term population explosion, and this article of his from the 1960s has been widely cited as the strongest link between mortality decline and fertility decline as stages of the demographic transition.
Kingsley Davis, like a number of other readings for this course, originally served as the text for his presidential address given to the Population Association of America. His address from 1963 subsequently appeared in the PAA journal Population Index. It was not until some years later that the tradition got started to publish each year's presidential address in the PAA journal Demography instead. Davis was one of the pioneers of demographic transition theory. In this article, he starts with two of the most dramatic demographic changes ever witnessed in the world and builds a theoretical and empirical link between them. The first of these changes was falling death rates that began to appear in countries around the world, and the second was the falling birth rates that also began to appear, usually somewhat later. This is the clearest and also one of the earliest demonstrations that the two trends might well be connected to each other. To illustrate this connection, he chooses to focus most of the article on the country of Japan. Why, we might ask, would he choose Japan instead of perhaps the United States or someplace in Europe? At the beginning of the article, he offers two reasons for looking at Japan. First, he says, Japan is a fully industrialized modern country. By his emphasis on this point, we immediately can see that he is basing his analysis firmly in the mainstream explanation for both mortality and fertility declines, the modernization argument that links demographic change to modernization and rising prosperity. On this point, he just as easily could have chosen any one of a number of other advanced industrialized countries from the middle of the 20th century. But the second reason that he gives stresses the fact that Japan is home to a traditional Asian non-Western culture. By such a cultural setting, Davis implicitly sets up a test of the competing argument that demographic change is not really a matter of industrialization, urbanization, or modernization. It is really a product of the distinctive cultural history of Western Europe, and the places where people from Western Europe may have spread their colonies, like the United States or Canada or Australia. This cultural explanation suggests that economic development and modernization itself was a byproduct of that cultural background, just as for demographic change, that all of these outcomes were parallel results, not causes or effects of one another. If that were true, then it should not be possible to simply transplant the modernization process into some other culture and have it produce the same kind of demographic changes. Davis intends to show that it really is modernization and not some mysterious, unique cultural pattern from Europe that drives what he called the demographic transition. He documents this transition first by starting with several years of birth statistics from Japan. In 1, he shows us that the total number of live births in Japan dropped by an incredible 40% in just a 10-year period immediately after World War II. He points out this is one of the fastest fertility declines ever recorded in any human society. In the United States and parts of Western Europe, a decline of this magnitude in birth rates took most of a century to accomplish. Given this astonishing change, naturally Davis asks, how did the Japanese manage it? And the same Table 1 immediately suggests an answer for us, because he also includes a column of numbers showing the number of induced abortions recorded in Japan during the same years. As the number of births dropped each year, the number of recorded abortions increased each year. In fact, it is interesting to note that if you add together the births and the abortions for each year to get the total number of recorded pregnancies, this resulting sum remains almost exactly the same every year throughout the entire decade. Out of this constant number of pregnancies, more and more ended in abortion, so fewer and fewer ended in live birth. As part of the post-war changes in Japanese government introduced by the victorious Allies, abortion was legalized and made into a normal, freely available medical procedure. In part, this might have been due to the rapid population growth that had been going on during the decades leading up to the Second World War, and possibly to perceptions by some in the Allied governments that such rapid population growth had been one of the factors stimulating Japanese imperialism and contributing to the start of the war itself. The new abortion policy might even have been part of a never again strategy by the Allies. Davis points out that it is deceptive to just add up totals of births and abortions and to think that the rise in one outcome simply cancels out the fall in the other. He explains that the interval between births is usually at least 9 months of pregnancy plus some period of postpartum recovery that may include nursing a new infant, which can delay another pregnancy even longer. There is usually a year or two or even longer between live births. In contrast, induced abortions usually occur very early in pregnancy, normally before the end of the first 3-month trimester. After an abortion, there is also no postpartum period of reduced susceptibility to another conception, because there is no period of nursing an infant. It is possible for women to have induced abortions much more often than live births. Therefore, one recorded abortion only takes a woman out of circulation as a candidate for another pregnancy for a fraction of the time that she would be out of circulation to produce a live birth. An induced abortion would return a woman to the population at risk of another pregnancy much sooner. So theoretically, fertility should not decline by one whole birth for every registered induced abortion. Something else must also have been going on in Japan, says Davis. We will return to what this something else might have been in a moment, but first there is another point about the numbers in this table that Davis wants to make. Many people reading Davis's article in 1963 would immediately have dismissed this idea of abortions as a way to lower birth rates as outrageous, even immoral. After all, the Roe v. Wade decision on abortion by the U.S. Supreme Court was still a decade in the future when he was writing this, and abortion was illegal in the United States and many other countries. As a sociologist with a long history of writing unemotional, fact-based analyses of controversial topics, though, Davis suffered no such pangs. He had already published groundbreaking studies of prostitution, interracial marriage, and other taboo subjects early in his career, and he knew that despite the surface appearance of moral outrage over induced abortion, most Western societies, including the United States and countries in Western Europe, also had a long history of substantial numbers of induced abortions. He cites evidence from several of these countries that abortion may also have played a role in falling birth rates in some of these other places. The biggest difference was that in Japan, the lack of a strong religious condemnation of the practice meant that abortions there were open and well recorded, while in the West they tended to be clandestine, often illegal procedures that usually did not make it into the account books of national vital statistics. Americans who grew up in the decades before Roe v. Wade usually could recall for you the names of young women who disappeared from high schools and communities for some weeks or months, and then just as mysteriously reappeared and went on with their lives. Very little was said about where they might have been during such intervals. So Davis starts off his analysis of how Japan managed to lower its birth rate so dramatically in one decade by pointing out the major role played by induced abortion as an alternative outcome for pregnancies. He already warns us from the beginning, though, that this was not the whole story. We can see this even more clearly if we look ahead over the next 50 years after his article was written and consider a longer sequence of birth and abortion rates in Japan. In this chart, based on the same vital statistics records used by Davis, but updated into the new century, we see first the opposite movements of birth and abortion rates during the decade that he studied, from 1949 through 1959. During this early post-war period, birth rates fell while abortion rates increased. From this, we might conclude that the two kinds of outcomes were substitutes for each other. More abortions mean fewer births. Similarly, after the peak of abortion rates, just about the time that Davis wrote his article, the incidence of abortion in Japan then trended downward steadily for another 15 years or so. During these years of declining abortion rates, birth rates in Japan began to increase, and Japan experienced its own post-war baby boom, though it came later and did not last as long as the baby boom in the United States and other Western countries. So again, during the second period, from about 1960 until the mid-1970s, abortion and birth rates moved in opposite directions in Japan. Again, this is consistent with the idea that they are substitutes for each other. But now consider what happened in Japan during the 40 years since the mid-1970s. After the peak of the Japanese baby boom in about 1975, the birth rate began a steady, long-term decline from over 2 million births a year to only about 1 million births a year, even though the Japanese population itself continued to grow during these decades. This means that the birth rate, or births per thousand population, was going down even faster than indicated by this chart. Given what we have already said about births and abortions being alternatives to each other, this should have meant that when the birth rate started trending downward again, the abortion rates should have turned back up and should have increased continuously over the same 40-year period. Instead, this chart clearly shows us that the total of abortions also dropped steadily at about the same rate as the fall in births. The two curves are essentially parallel to each other after 1975 or so. This means that the total number of pregnancies happening in each year itself was falling dramatically, leading to both fewer abortions and fewer births. So abortion can only be part of the explanation for Japan's fertility decline. There must be other things going on in the country as well to account for these declines in both births and abortions. We turn next to what Davis suggests that these other things might have been. Before Kingsley Davis's article appeared, birth and abortion rates moved in opposite directions. This even remained true for more than a decade after his PAA presidential address was published. Whenever one rate went down, the other went up. Since the 1970s, though, both births and abortions have been declining at the same time in Japan. Obviously, a falling abortion rate can't explain a falling birth rate. But Davis knew that this was only part of the story, even at the time that he was writing this paper. What other things did he think might be related to Japan's lower birth rate? The first of these that he singles out for attention was the spread of new contraceptive technologies. In addition to barrier methods like condoms, the decade of the 1960s brought the advent of hormonal oral contraceptives, and the most common and popular contraceptive method in the world, both then and now, the IUD, or intrauterine device, that could be implanted and then just left in place to prevent pregnancies from starting. The introduction of all these new ways not to get pregnant meant that couples could have fewer births and also fewer induced abortions at the same time, because fewer pregnancies would ever get started. Since that time, at the middle of the 20th century, a whole international industry has grown up around producing contraceptives, convincing people that they were safe and effective, and assisting people to find and start using these methods. As we will see later, a major new argument sprang up in response to the contraceptive revolution over whether these contraceptives and the family planning programs that delivered them were all that was needed to solve any country's population problems. Of course, the family planners thought that this was a perfectly good solution, but many of the scholars who had argued for the importance of more fundamental modernization and transformation of societies, including Kingsley Davis, were skeptical of these claims that family planning would solve the population problem all by itself and get rid of the ethical problem of induced abortion at the same time. In addition to these contraceptives that could be used as short-term ways to prevent pregnancies, a more drastic measure also appeared on the scene with increasing frequency. Davis was able to observe this increase in Japan, where more people began to choose permanent sterilization, that is, vasectomies for men and tubal ligations for women, that literally cut off a person's ability to reproduce. sterilization made temporary contraceptives unnecessary. This option of sterilization, however, has never become widely adopted in any population. It certainly was not widely adopted in Japan, though resort to these procedures did increase in the post-war period. Another solution that Davis detected among Japanese families actually had nothing to do with affecting birth rates and did not contribute to fertility decline at all. However, this means of population control could be very effective at the immediate local level. If people found that they had given birth to too many children, some of the children could be encouraged when they became a little older to simply get on a train and go away to someplace else. This did nothing about the overall increase in population at the national or global level, but if people got on trains and went to Tokyo, or got on ships and airplanes and went off to America or perhaps Peru, this actually was a perfectly effective solution to overpopulation at the local level. To the extent that a rural village had this migration option available, birth rates could remain high and any resulting population problem would still go away. This migration solution to population problems is often overlooked, even today, when people are considering the issue of population growth. Demographers have shown, though, that this certainly could not offer a solution to the bigger problem of global population growth, because it would require something like 100 rocket ships taking off every hour to remove all the people now being added continuously to the world's population. Still, Davis thought about this alternative 50 years ago and added it to his list. But the other major change that Japanese couples did make in the post-war period had a direct and powerful impact on both birth and abortion rates. Contraceptives were not the only way for people to avoid pregnancies. In Japan, sexual and reproductive activities always has been closely contained within the bounds of formal marriages. So if people postpone marriages to later ages in Japan, they automatically prevent most conceptions, births, and also induced abortions at all these younger ages, younger than the new later age at marriage. And this is exactly what we see happening in dramatic fashion in the post-war period. In fact, the delayed marriage trend in Japan can be traced well back to the early decades of the 20th century. For example, back in 1920, over two-thirds, nearly 69% of all young Japanese women at ages 20 through 24 were already married. Yet 35 years later, over half of these marriages had disappeared, and only one-third of women at these ages had ever been married. This very strong delayed marriage trend in Japan obviously played a major part in lowering the country's birth rate. This aspect of the fertility decline would have pleased Malthus very much, since delayed marriage was exactly what he recommended as the best possible way to prevent excess population growth. Delayed marriages only go so far in Japan, however. While the share of women married at the youngest adult ages did drop dramatically, eventually everyone gets married there. For example, the percentages married by ages 40 to 44 are very close to 100% for both men and women in all years shown. This nearly universal marriage pattern means that Japan gives no evidence at all of the final possible way that Davis says a society can reduce its birth rate. That is, permanent avoidance of marriage, or what he calls celibacy. Other societies, as we will see later, have developed institutionalized ways of life, such as religious orders, that can accommodate more people who never marry and who never have children at all during their entire lifetimes. This was not an option adopted in Japan. Based on his example of data from Japan, Davis then develops a more general profile of all these possible ways that a society can lower birth rates. He mentions the first method he examined, induced abortion, but also lists contraception and even the more permanent strategy of sterilization. Then he reminds us that at least at the local level, outmigration can be a substitute for actually lowering the birth rate as a reaction to too much population growth. While outmigration does not actually lower birth rates and may actually allow them to remain high longer than they might have otherwise, this solution will keep a population from getting too large, at least for local areas. He completes his list of ways that the Japanese brought down the birth rate with the strategy of delayed marriages that they use so effectively. But the Japanese example is incomplete as far as Davis is concerned, because they did not utilize the final option that he considers. Increased celibacy was not part of the package of options adopted in Japan. With nearly universal marriage, there was no significant group of people in Japanese society who remained single all their lives, never marrying and never having any children at all. Even though it did not appear in Japan, Davis insists on including this celibacy option on his list. Once the list is fully assembled and we can see all the options that Davis calls the multiphasic response, we have a pretty good overall picture of all the ways that a society can bring down a birth rate. But this leaves a more fundamental question still unanswered, and so far even unasked. If all of these options are part of a society-wide response, what is it that people are responding to? What was the stimulus that called forth this response in the population? Davis's answer is very simple and goes to the heart of his main idea in this article, because his answer is the falling death rate, particularly the falling death rate for infants and children. This connection of mortality decline to fertility decline made his article famous and transmitted the idea to countless other scholars, including several that we have already considered, like Karen Oppenheim-Mason, who cites this article by Davis extensively. We now turn to the details of how he made this connection between death rates and birth rates. For a stimulus that could have caused the Japanese to use all their different multiphasic responses and bring down the birth rate so dramatically, he guessed that it must have been the earlier fall of death rates in the country. We can see that his guess makes good sense when we consider a chart showing the death rate for infants and children in Japan under age 5. Despite a gap in national statistics caused by disruptions of the Second World War, we can see that this death rate dropped at the same steep rate over time that we already observed for the birth rate. The difference for this death rate curve, though, is that the decline shown here started earlier than the fall in the birth rate. A big chunk of the mortality decline already had happened before the World War ever started, and the downward trend then continued on pretty much the same path after the end of the war and the Japanese defeat. Better infant survival thus appeared in Japan before birth rates began to decline. This sequence looked to Davis like a case of cause and effect. But how did he think this cause might have worked? His logic was quite simple. If infants and children die, but the birth rate remains constant at traditional higher levels, parents will quickly discover that more of their children are surviving than they expected, and they are ending up with households crowded with more children than they intended to have. Among people still engaged in farming, which was still a very large part of the Japanese population in the early 20th century, this created a very serious problem. Japan is one of many societies that practice what is called equal testation. That is, all children in a family, or at least all sons, inherit equal shares of the family estate when the parents are gone. When more children survive, each of them gets a smaller share of this inheritance. Any parent thinking ahead about the well-being and prosperity of children would naturally worry about this. Just that such concerns prompted people to begin marrying later, using contraceptives, and in some cases choosing induced abortions. Families that did not adopt any of these solutions to better survival of children would be faced with either sending away some children to seek their fortunes in the wider world, or leave to divide smaller and more numerous shares of the family estate. Kingsley Davis had a famous way of describing this stimulus and response, which he used to enjoy explaining to people. He sometimes compared populations to donkeys and asked, what is the best way to motivate a donkey? Do you hit it with a stick to make it go, or offer it a carrot as an incentive to get moving? He liked to think about this carrot or stick question in connection with the motivations of people to change their habits and have fewer children. Did people delay marriages, use contraceptives, and adopt other solutions because they felt increasingly miserable and impoverished by too many children? That would be the stick explanation. This never seems to have worked, since we have seen many times that the rich get richer while the poor get babies. Or did the Japanese adopt these solutions because they saw new opportunities for themselves and their children, opportunities opening up due to the larger process of modernization taking place around them? This would be the carrot explanation, that people were avoiding too many births because they saw all the new possibilities for themselves and their children that would be lost if they ended up with too big a family. Throughout his life, Davis was a big believer in the carrot explanation instead of the stick. He firmly believed that people are motivated to change their reproductive behavior by opportunities, not by misery or poverty or hardships. After all, that is one reason why he chose Japan as an example to study. Japan showed him and us a traditional Asian, non-Western culture that experienced rapid modernization in the early 20th century, including rapid improvements in infant and child survival. Suggests that the Japanese people responded to this situation by drastically altering the most intimate aspects of their personal lives and bringing down the birth rate as well as the death rate faster and farther than had ever been seen before. You may wonder whether the possible motivations that Davis describes are actually carrots or sticks, that is, choices made to take advantage of opportunities or to solve threats and hardships. The arguments about having fewer children so they would each inherit bigger portions of land and other assets from their parents could perhaps be seen either way on this point. Similarly, the idea of sending some children away to seek their fortunes in cities or across the sea might be seen by some people as a response to the hardships of a bigger surviving family. In a larger sense, his carrot explanation fits the Japanese picture quite well, because Japan as a whole was the one Asian country where modernization was creating a lot of new carrots for people, and that is also where we find the first dramatic fall in birth rates. To check his logic, Davis then looks around for another example, another society where he can look for his multiphasic response. Where else, he asks, did modernizing countries experience a period of rapid population growth after death rates started to decline, but birth rates still remained high? This is an easy question for him to answer. He points out that practically every country in northwestern Europe had gone through the same process long before Japan started down this path in the 20th century. In every one of those countries, Davis insists, we also find a similar pattern of people resorting to his whole multiphasic list of possible responses. He summed up all these cases in favor of his explanation based on the carrot rather than the stick. Quote, under a prolonged drop in mortality with industrialization, people in Northwest Europe and Japan found that their accustomed demographic behavior was handicapping them in their effort to take advantage of the opportunities being provided by the emerging economy. They accordingly began to change their behavior, unquote. For Davis, it was as simple as that. In some places, like Scandinavian countries, he described extended periods of many decades in the 1800s when lower death rates produced rapid population growth, but without any apparent immediate response from marriage patterns or birth rates. This was possible, he says, because in the 1800s, the doors of the world were pretty much open for migrants, and huge numbers of people poured out of these rapidly growing rural populations into cities and even into steamships that carried them away across the oceans. In fact, this is exactly what happened to all four of my own grandparents. They came from poor families in Sweden and Norway, families that had a lot of children, and all of the children started to survive and grow up into adults. Nearly all of these children subsequently left Norway and Sweden. First, one brother would venture out to America, and then he would help the next brother, and then both of them would help a third, and soon most of the kids were living on the other side of the world. This migration escape valve allowed the excess population pressure to escape from these modernizing societies as steam escapes from a tea kettle, until eventually delayed marriages and other responses actually brought down the birth rates. But in many cases, these migrants who left rural areas, both in Japan and in northwestern Europe, sent back both money and information that had its own impact on the people still living in the rural villages. Actually, all these emerging aspects of economic growth led to delayed marriage and lower birth rates in both urban and rural areas, even the rural areas that had enjoyed the option of outmigration of early surpluses of population. To see whether his general explanation can be applied to specific cases, Davis then bravely tackles the demographic history of Ireland, which he says, quote, is habitually cited as a country having in modern times a population history unlike that of any other nation, unquote. The statistical picture that he paints using data from Ireland and other countries in Northwest Europe shows us that Ireland was not at all as unique as people apparently thought it was. Like other countries in the region, he says, the Irish responded to mortality decline and prolonged population growth with most of his multiphasic responses. They married later and later as the 1800s progressed. They emigrated to America and other places. They even appear to have practiced contraception and induced abortion to some extent, despite their strong Roman Catholicism and laws that criminalized such practices. And they actually added the option that Japan did not use. A fairly large fraction of men and women in Ireland never married or had children at all. So Davis feels vindicated in claiming that whenever any population had the good fortune to experience falling death rates, the resulting population growth created pressures in the personal lives of people whose numerous children all survived, and led them to adopt a similar diverse set of responses no matter where they lived or what kind of culture surrounded them. They married later or not at all, practiced contraception and induced abortion, and moved away toward urban centers in response to the pull of emerging economic growth and prosperity. Such prosperity in turn reinforced all these tendencies as people limited their families in order to take advantage of the new possibilities. This idea of the multiphasic response to mortality decline has taken root in the work of countless other scholars who have studied the demographic transition around the world.